The one-room schoolhouse in Cedar Valley, Utah Territory, 1885, felt smaller each day as winter approached. Elsie Matthews watched her last student disappear into the amber twilight, knowing that come spring, the town council would close the school forever. At 28, she'd already buried one life back east, a life that involved blood, betrayal, and a brother she could never speak of again. The heavy footsteps on the wooden porch announced trouble before the knock came. Through the frost-etched window she saw him, Jacob Morrison, the Mormon rancher whose wife had died birthing their third son 6 months ago. His weathered hands twisted his hat as he stepped inside, his eyes desperate but determined. "Miss Matthews, I'll speak plain. My ranch is failing, my boys need mothering, and winter's coming hard. You need security, and I need help." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm proposing a partnership, marriage in name, separate lives in practice." Elsie's heart hammered against her ribs. If she stayed, she risked discovery. If she fled again, little Sammy Morrison and his brothers would face another loss. But what Jacob didn't know was that Elsie Matthews wasn't her real name, and the skills that made her an excellent teacher weren't the only ones she possessed. She set down the slate she'd been cleaning and turned to face him fully. Jacob Morrison stood 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe, but something about his posture spoke of defeat rather than strength. His dark hair was prematurely streaked with silver, and deep lines etched the corners of his brown eyes that had seen too much sorrow for a man barely past 30. "Mr. Morrison, that's quite a proposition." Her voice remained steady despite the chaos in her mind. "Perhaps you should sit down." He glanced at the small wooden chair beside her desk, clearly built for children, and remained standing. "I know it sounds desperate because it is. The bank's threatening foreclosure, and I can't manage the ranch and 3 boys alone." He paused, his jaw working. Mary was everything to them, to me. The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded. Elsie recognized it because she carried her own version of that same ache. The difference was that Jacob Morrison's loss came from love, while hers came from necessity, the necessity of leaving everything behind when her brother's crimes finally caught up to their family. "Your boys," she said carefully, "they're good children. Samuel works hard in his studies, despite everything. Sammy's the strong one, takes after his mother." Jacob's mouth tightened. "But little Thomas hasn't spoken since the funeral, and baby William, he needs more than I can give him." Through the window, Elsie could see the first fat snowflakes beginning to fall. Winter in Utah Territory was unforgiving, especially for those without proper shelter or provisions. She'd saved enough money for passage to California, maybe Oregon, but starting over again meant building new lies, creating another identity, always looking over her shoulder. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked. "A home, my name, protection." He met her gaze directly. "In exchange, help with the boys and the household, nothing more unless someday we both wanted something different." The honesty in his proposal surprised her. Most men would have dressed it up with pretty words or false promises. Jacob Morrison was offering a business arrangement, and after 3 years of running, the idea of stability held dangerous appeal. "And your faith? The church?" She knew enough about Mormon communities to understand that an outsider, especially a woman with no family connections, would face scrutiny. "I'll handle the bishop. You'd convert for appearance's sake. Most folks are too concerned with their own troubles to pry too deeply into ours." If only he knew how deeply some people could pry. The Pinkerton detectives her brother's former associates had hired wouldn't be deterred by a remote Utah town or a new surname. But they'd been quiet for months now. Perhaps they'd given up. Perhaps she could risk staying. "I need time to consider this." Jacob nodded, though she could see the disappointment flicker across his features. "Of course. But Miss Matthews, I should mention, I've heard talk that the territorial marshal might be coming through soon. Something about wanted criminals who might have fled west." The blood drained from Elsie's face so quickly that she had to grip the edge of her desk to steady herself. Jacob noticed her reaction, his eyebrows drawing together in concern. "Are you all right? You look pale." "Just tired," she managed. "It's been a long day." He studied her for another moment, then placed his hat back on his head. "I'll need an answer by Sunday, Miss Matthews, after church services. Whatever your decision, I respect it, but I can't wait longer than that." When the door closed behind him, Elsie sank into her chair, her hands trembling. The territorial marshal could mean routine business, or it could mean her carefully constructed world was about to crumble. Again. Outside, the snow fell harder, blanketing Cedar Valley in pristine white that reminded her how quickly beautiful things could cover up dark truths. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as Clara Whitmore rang the brass bell, calling her students in from their games of tag and marbles. She watched them file past her into the one-room schoolhouse, their faces bright with the innocence she envied more each day. 8 years of teaching in Millbrook had given her a reputation as the stern but fair Miss Whitmore, a woman who could handle the rowdiest boys and coax shy girls into reading aloud. What they didn't know was that every night she checked the locks twice and kept a derringer in her desk drawer. "Tommy Henderson, please collect the slates from yesterday," she instructed, smoothing her dark blue dress as she moved to the front of the classroom. Her eyes automatically scanned the room, noting which children seemed tired, which bore new bruises from farm work, and which chairs sat empty. The Garrett children were absent again. She'd heard whispers in town about their father's struggles since his wife's passing last spring. As her students settled into their morning arithmetic, Clara's mind wandered to the conversation she'd overheard at Brennan's general store yesterday. Mrs. Brennan and the pastor's wife had been discussing Daniel Garrett's mounting debts and the bank's threats to foreclose on his ranch. They'd spoken in hushed tones about how he was barely keeping food on the table for his 3 children, and how little Emma, only 6 years old, had been seen in town wearing her deceased mother's altered dress because there was no money for proper clothing. The thought stirred something uncomfortable in Clara's chest. She knew what it meant to be desperate, to face impossible choices with no good outcomes. 8 years ago, she'd arrived in Millbrook with nothing but a forged teaching certificate, a new name, and the clothes on her back. The woman who had fled Chicago in the dead of night, whose real name was Catherine Walsh, had died somewhere on that westward train. Clara Whitmore had been born in the space between one depot and the next. "Miss Whitmore?" Little Sarah Peterson's voice pulled her back to the present. "I can't remember how to carry the one." Clara moved to Sarah's desk, gently guiding the girl's small hand as they worked through the problem together. Teaching had become more than just a livelihood to her. It was absolution. Every child she helped learn to read, every young mind she shaped, felt like a small payment against the debt she owed to a world she'd damaged in her former life. The morning progressed through reading, penmanship, and geography. During the noon recess, Clara sat at her desk picking at the apple and cheese she brought for lunch when she noticed a figure approaching the schoolhouse. Through the window, she recognized Daniel Garrett's tall frame and purposeful stride. Her pulse quickened, though she couldn't say why. He knocked softly on the open door before entering, removing his hat to reveal hair that needed cutting and eyes that held the weight of too many sleepless nights. His clothes were clean but worn, mended in places with careful stitches that spoke of necessity rather than choice. "Miss Whitmore, I hope I'm not interrupting your meal." "Not at all, Mr. Garrett. Please, come in." She set down her apple and folded her hands, grateful for the desk between them. Up close, she could see the lines that grief and worry had carved around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested too much coffee and too little food. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, his hat clutched in his hands. "I wanted to apologize for my children's absences. I know Emma and Michael should be here, but—" He trailed off, his jaw working as if the words were too difficult to form. "There's no need to explain, Mr. Garrett. I understand these are difficult times." Something in her tone made him look at her more closely. "Do you understand, I mean?" The question hung between them, loaded with more weight than simple curiosity. Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever someone looked too deeply, asked too much, But in Daniel's face, she saw not suspicion but a kind of recognition, as if he too knew what it meant to carry secrets. "I understand that sometimes survival requires us to make choices we never imagined we'd face," she said carefully. He nodded slowly, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through the careful facade she'd built. "Miss Whitmore, I wonder if I might speak with you after school today, about a matter that requires discretion." Before she could respond, the children began streaming back into the classroom, their voices bright and boisterous. Daniel stepped aside to let them pass, but his eyes never left Clara's face. "Very well," she heard herself say, "after school." He nodded once and was gone, leaving Clara to wonder what proposition could possibly require such careful privacy, and why her heart was beating as if she already knew the answer would change everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as Clara swept the front steps, her mind still churning from yesterday's unexpected encounter. She'd barely slept, Thomas Mitchell's proposition echoing in her thoughts like a persistent church bell. The desperation in his eyes had been unmistakable, but it was the quiet dignity with which he'd carried himself that unsettled her most. "Miss Hartwell?" A small voice interrupted her reverie. She looked down to find Emma Mitchell standing at the bottom of the steps, her dark hair braided neatly, but her dress wrinkled as if she'd slept in it. The child's blue eyes, so like her father's, held a wariness that no 7-year-old should possess. "Good morning, Emma. You're early today." The girl shifted her worn leather satchel from one shoulder to the other. "Pa had to ride out to check the north pasture before the bankman comes." She paused, then added quietly, "He said I shouldn't bother you none about yesterday." Clara's chest tightened. She knelt down, bringing herself to Emma's eye level. "You could never be a bother, sweetheart. Would you like to help me prepare the slates for today's lesson?" Emma's face brightened marginally, and she nodded. As they worked together in the quiet classroom, Clara found herself studying the child's delicate features, noting how she handled the chalk with careful precision, how she arranged the slates in perfectly straight rows. There was something achingly familiar about the girl's need for order, for control in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. "Miss Hartwell?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think the bank will really take our house?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Clara set down the slate she was cleaning and chose her words carefully. "I think your father is a very determined man, who loves you and your brother very much. But that doesn't always matter, does it? Love, I mean." Emma's matter-of-fact tone was heartbreaking in its wisdom. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. A black carriage pulled by 2 well-groomed bays came to a stop in front of the school, and Clara's blood turned to ice water in her veins. A man in an expensive dark suit emerged from the carriage, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. He moved with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to wielding power, his pale eyes scanning the modest building with obvious disdain. When his gaze found the window where Clara stood, his thin lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "Stay here," Clara whispered to Emma, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Don't come outside, no matter what you hear." She stepped onto the porch, forcing her spine straight and her expression neutral. "Mr. Blackwood, I wasn't expecting visitors today." Silas Blackwood's smile widened as he approached, his polished boots clicking against the wooden steps. "My dear Catherine, or do you prefer Clara now? Such a charming little charade you've created for yourself here." "I don't know what you're talking about." The lie felt bitter on her tongue, but desperation made her bold. "My name is Clara Hartwell, and I'm the schoolteacher here." "Of course you are." His voice was silk over steel. "And I'm sure these good people have no idea that their sweet, innocent schoolmarm is actually Catherine Sinclair, wanted for the murder of her husband in Philadelphia." The words hit like physical blows, each one carefully calculated to destroy. Clara's hands trembled, but she kept them clasped tightly in front of her. "I didn't kill anyone." "No? Then why did you run? Why change your name, your appearance?" He circled her slowly, like a wolf stalking wounded prey. "The authorities are very interested in your whereabouts, Catherine. Very interested indeed. What do you want?" Blackwood's laugh was cold as winter wind. "What I've always wanted, my dear. You, at my side, as my wife, where you belong. Your little rebellion has been amusing, but it's time to come home. Never." The word escaped before she could stop it, fueled by 2 years of carefully buried rage and pain. He tisked softly. "Such a shame. I'd hate for these simple frontier folk to learn the truth about their beloved teacher. Imagine how it would affect the children, especially that sweet Mitchell girl watching from the window." Clara's heart lurched. Emma stood pressed against the glass, her small face pale with confusion and fear. In that moment, Clara saw her carefully constructed new life crumbling like a house of cards in a windstorm. "I need time to consider," she said finally, hating herself for the words. Blackwood's smile returned in full force. "Of course. Shall we say 3 days? I'm staying at the hotel in town. Don't keep me waiting too long, Catherine. My patience isn't what it once was, and I'd hate for your secret to slip out accidentally." He tipped his hat mockingly and returned to his carriage, leaving Clara standing alone on the porch, her past and present colliding with devastating force. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as Clara rang the brass bell, calling her students to order. She had barely slept, Thomas MacKinnon's proposal echoing in her mind like a persistent church bell. The children filed past her, little Mary with her crooked braids, Sam dragging his feet through the dust, and the Hendricks twins whispering secrets only they understood. "Miss Hartwell, you look tired," announced Jenny Sullivan, with the brutal honesty only a 10-year-old could muster. Clara managed a smile, though it felt thin as paper. "Perhaps a bit, dear. Now, who can tell me what we learned yesterday about the Oregon Territory?" The familiar rhythm of teaching usually soothed her, but today every moment dragged like molasses. Her students' voices seemed to come from underwater, and she found herself staring out the window toward the distant mountains, those same peaks she'd crossed 2 years ago with nothing but a carpetbag and fear nipping at her heels. When the children finally departed for their midday meal, Clara remained at her desk, absently grading arithmetic papers. The numbers blurred together until footsteps on the schoolhouse porch made her look up. Martha Brennan stood in the doorway, her weathered face creased with concern. At 63, Martha delivered half the babies in Willowbrook and buried the other half when their time came. She possessed the particular wisdom of women who'd seen too much to be shocked by anything. "Heard Thomas MacKinnon paid you a visit yesterday evening," Martha said without preamble, settling her considerable frame into one of the student chairs with surprising grace. Clara set down her pen carefully. News travels quickly in small towns. Quickly and accurately. The man's desperate, Clara. Those children of his are running wild, and the bank's been sniffing around his property like vultures. Martha's keen blue eyes studied Clara's face. "Question is, what did you tell him?" "I told him I needed time to consider." "Sensible." Martha nodded approvingly. "Marriage ain't something to rush into, even the practical kind. Though I'll say this, Thomas is a good man. Lost his way some after Rebecca died, but his heart's sound." Clara's fingers traced the edge of her desk. She'd heard the story, of course. Rebecca MacKinnon had been beloved in the community, known for her gentle nature and skill with healing herbs. Her death from fever 3 years ago had left Thomas floundering, trying to manage grief, children, and a failing ranch all at once. "Martha," Clara began slowly, "what do you know about my past?" The older woman's expression didn't change. "I know you came here with good references and a love for teaching. I know you've been nothing but respectful and hard-working since you arrived. And I know that sometimes a person's past ain't anybody's business but their own." The simple acceptance in Martha's voice nearly undid Clara's careful composure. She'd grown so accustomed to looking over her shoulder, to crafting careful answers for probing questions, that genuine kindness still caught her off guard. "If I were to consider Thomas's proposal," Clara said carefully, "there might be Complications. Martha leaned forward, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. Child, we've all got complications. The question is whether you're willing to trust somebody else with them. Before Clara could respond, the sound of running feet interrupted them. Jamie McKinnon burst through the schoolhouse door, his face flushed and streaked with tears. "Miss Hartwell," he gasped, "you gotta come quick. Emma fell in the creek, and she won't wake up proper." Clara's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. "Where is she now?" Pa pulled her out and carried her home, but she's all pale and cold. Jamie's voice cracked with fear. "Doc Henderson's out at the Jacoby place delivering a baby. Pa sent me to fetch you 'cause you helped when Mrs. Cooper's boy got kicked by that horse." Without hesitation, Clara grabbed her shawl and the small medical kit she kept for school emergencies. "Martha, can you watch for the children when they return?" "Go," Martha said firmly. "I'll handle things here." Clara followed Jamie's frantic pace through town, her heart hammering against her ribs. The McKinnon house sat at the edge of Willowbrook, a modest two-story structure with a wraparound porch and flower boxes that had seen better days. Thomas met them at the door, his hair disheveled and shirt soaked from the creek. "She was playing by the water while I mended fence," he said without preamble, anguish raw in his voice. "I heard the splash and turned around, but she'd already gone under." Clara pushed past him into the house, following the sound of labored breathing to a small bedroom where 8-year-old Emma lay motionless on a patchwork quilt. Her lips held the faintest blue tinge, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. All thoughts of marriage proposals and dangerous pasts vanished. Clara knelt beside the bed and began checking Emma's pulse, her hands steady despite the circumstances. Some things, she'd learned, mattered more than fear. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as Clara arranged primers on her desk, trying to push away thoughts of Samuel's proposal. 3 days had passed since their conversation, and she'd managed to avoid him by timing her errands carefully and keeping busy with lesson preparations. But avoidance wouldn't work forever in a town the size of Millbrook. The bell above the schoolhouse door chimed, and she looked up expecting her first students. Instead, a small figure in a patched brown dress stood hesitantly in the doorway. "Emma." Clara set down her books. "You're early today." Samuel's daughter stepped inside, her dark hair braided but already coming loose at the temples. She clutched a wooden lunch pail against her chest like armor. "Papa said I could come help you before school starts." Clara's heart squeezed. The child's eagerness reminded her painfully of herself at that age, desperate for any scrap of attention or affection. "That's very thoughtful. Would you like to help me clean the slate board?" Emma nodded vigorously and set her lunch pail on a desk. As she worked, carefully wiping away yesterday's arithmetic problems, Clara studied the girl's profile. She had Samuel's strong jaw but softer features, and there was an intelligence in her dark eyes that suggested she understood more about her family's situation than anyone realized. "Miss Porter?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you really going to marry Papa?" Clara's hand stilled on the books she'd been organizing. "What makes you ask that?" "I heard Mrs. Henderson talking to Mrs. Caldwell at the general store. She said Papa asked you, and that you'd be crazy to say no because we need looking after." Emma's cheeks flushed pink, but then Mrs. Caldwell said you probably think you're too good for us. The casual cruelty of small-town gossip never failed to astound Clara. She knelt beside Emma's chair, choosing her words carefully. "What do you think about it?" Emma's rag moved in careful circles across the slate. "I think it would be nice to have a mama again. Thomas doesn't remember ours much, but I do. She used to sing when she cooked, and she smelled like lavender soap." She paused, glancing at Clara sideways. "You smell like books and chalk dust, but that's nice too, Emma. I know Papa doesn't love you the way he loved Mama," the girl continued with startling directness, "but maybe that would come later. In the stories you read us, sometimes people learn to love each other." Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn toward the door. Samuel appeared, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Morning, Miss Porter. Emma, I told you to help, not chatter the poor woman's ear off." "She wasn't bothering me," Clara said quickly, standing and smoothing her skirts. "We were just discussing literature." Samuel's eyes met hers, and she saw he wasn't fooled by her evasion. "Emma, why don't you go ring the bell for school? Other children will be arriving soon." The girl obediently headed outside, leaving them alone in the suddenly too small schoolroom. Samuel stepped closer, close enough that Clara could smell leather and soap and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken. "I don't mean to pressure you," he said quietly, "but I need to know. Mrs. Whitmore's given me until the end of the week to catch up the mortgage payments, or she's putting the ranch up for sale." Clara's stomach dropped. She'd hoped for more time to think, to find another solution, to somehow escape the impossible choice between safety and, what, love? She barely knew this man, despite the way her heart raced when he looked at her with those steady blue eyes. "And if I say yes, what exactly would you expect from such a marriage?" Samuel's jaw tightened slightly. "Respect, partnership, someone to help raise my children and keep the household running." He paused, studying her face. "I won't lie and promise feelings I don't have, Clara. But I can promise you'll be treated well and that whatever you're running from, you'd have the protection of my name." The last words hit her like a physical blow. He knew, maybe not the details, but he'd sensed the fear she carried, the careful way she'd constructed her new life. The offer of protection was almost more tempting than anything else. "The children need stability," he continued, "and I need help. It's not a grand love story, but it could be a good life." Outside, Emma's enthusiastic bell ringing announced the start of another school day. Soon Clara would need to put on her teacher's smile and pretend her world wasn't shifting beneath her feet. She looked at Samuel, really looked at him, and saw exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, worry in the set of his shoulders. He was drowning just as surely as she was, grasping for anything that might save them both. "I need until Friday," she said finally. He nodded once, replaced his hat, and headed for the door. Friday it is. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as Clara rang the brass bell, calling her students to lessons. She watched them file past, their faces bright with curiosity about their teacher's upcoming wedding. Word had spread through Millbrook like wildfire, and she found herself the subject of countless whispered conversations and knowing glances. "Miss Harper, is it true you're going to marry Mr. Garrett?" young Susie Chen asked, her dark eyes wide with excitement. Clara smoothed her navy skirt and managed a gentle smile. "Yes, Susie. Now, shall we begin our arithmetic lesson?" But concentration proved elusive. Through the schoolhouse windows, she could see the bustle of wedding preparations in the town square. Mrs. Patterson and the other church ladies had taken charge with military precision, transforming what should have been a simple courthouse ceremony into something resembling a celebration. Clara suspected Thomas had little say in the matter. The women of Millbrook rarely took no for an answer when it came to matters of the heart. During the lunch recess, Clara found herself standing at the window, watching her future stepchildren play with the other students. Emma had been shy at first, clinging to her brother's side, but now she was giggling with the Miller girls over a game of jacks. Samuel remained more reserved, though she'd caught him helping younger boys with their marbles, displaying the same quiet kindness she'd observed in his father. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the road. Thomas rode up on his bay gelding, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. He tied his horse to the hitching post and approached the schoolhouse, his hat in his hands. Clara met him at the door, acutely aware of the curious stares from her students. "Mr. Garrett, is everything all right? I hope I'm not disturbing your lessons." His voice carried that familiar note of uncertainty that seemed to surface whenever they were alone together. "I wanted to discuss some arrangements for tomorrow." She stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her. The afternoon air was crisp, carrying the scent of approaching winter. Of course. Thomas shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. The ladies have gotten a bit carried away with their planning. I want you to know that none of this was my doing. If you'd prefer something simpler, it's fine," Clara interrupted, surprising herself with the quickness of her response. "The town means well." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of tomorrow's ceremony hanging between them like morning fog. Clara studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers worried the brim of his hat. For all his practical reasoning about their arrangement, Thomas Garrett was clearly a man grappling with the enormity of what they were about to undertake. "There's something else," he said finally, "about the living arrangements. I've been thinking it might be best if you kept the room above the schoolhouse, at least initially, until things settle." Clara felt an unexpected pang of disappointment, though she couldn't quite name its source. "I see. It's not that I don't want—" Thomas stopped, color rising in his weathered cheeks. "What I mean is, the children need time to adjust, and we barely know each other. It seems the practical thing. Practical." The word had become something of a refrain in their conversations, a shield against the more complex emotions neither seemed willing to acknowledge. Clara nodded, telling herself she felt relief rather than rejection. "You're right, of course. The children's comfort should come first. I'll still expect you for meals," Thomas added quickly. "Breakfast and dinner at least. We should appear to be a proper family, naturally." Another silence stretched between them. Clara became aware of the sounds around them, children's laughter, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of wagon wheels on the main road. Normal sounds of a town going about its business while her entire world prepared to shift on its axis. Clara. The use of her first name made her look up, meeting his steady gaze. "I know this isn't what either of us planned for our lives, but I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to make this work, to make you feel welcomed." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, she glimpsed something beneath his careful composure, loneliness perhaps, or hope. It reminded her that Thomas Garrett was as much a stranger to this situation as she was, equally uncertain about the path they'd chosen. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." Thomas replaced his hat, the gesture marking the end of their conversation. "I should let you get back to your students. I'll see you tomorrow morning at the church." Clara watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the vast Montana landscape. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Thomas Garrett, wife to a man she barely knew, stepmother to children who needed stability more than affection. It was a practical arrangement, nothing more. So why did her heart feel anything but practical about it? The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as Emma rang the brass bell, calling her students to lessons. 3 weeks had passed since Samuel's proposal, and she'd managed to avoid giving him a direct answer by claiming she needed time to consider such an important decision. The truth was, she'd already made up her mind the moment he'd spoken the words. She just couldn't bring herself to voice it aloud. "Miss Hartwell, you're distracted again," observed Lucy Morrison, one of her older students, during the arithmetic lesson. The girl's knowing smile suggested she'd heard the town gossip about Samuel's frequent visits to the schoolhouse. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. Nonsense. Now, who can solve this problem on the board? But Lucy was right. Emma's thoughts kept drifting to Samuel's children, particularly little Sarah, who, taken to lingering after school to help clean the blackboard and arrange books. The child's hunger for maternal affection was painfully obvious, and Emma found herself looking forward to these quiet moments together almost as much as she dreaded them. Yesterday, Sarah had shyly asked if Emma knew any songs her mama used to sing. Emma had taught her a simple lullaby, watching the little girl's face light up with joy. When Samuel arrived to collect his daughter, he'd stood in the doorway listening to them sing together, something unreadable flickering across his weathered features. The school day ended, and Emma was gathering her papers when she noticed a rider approaching at an urgent pace. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the stranger's expensive suit and the way he sat his horse, like a man accustomed to having others do the dangerous work. He dismounted with calculated ease, his pale eyes scanning the schoolhouse before settling on her through the window. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for the small pistol hidden in her desk drawer, a precaution she'd hoped never to need. The man didn't approach the school directly. Instead, he tied his horse to the hitching post and walked toward the general store, but not before tipping his hat in her direction with a smile that made her skin crawl. She recognized him now. Marcus Webb, one of Vincent Kane's most trusted men. His presence could only mean one thing: they'd found her. That evening, Emma sat in her small cabin, staring at the telegram she'd received an hour after Webb's arrival. The message was simple: "Your debt remains unpaid. Time to come home. VC." She'd burned the paper immediately, but the words were seared into her memory. Vincent Kane had finally tracked her to Millbrook, just as she'd always known he would. The man who'd killed her husband and forced her to flee Chicago wasn't the type to forget or forgive, especially when she possessed information that could destroy his criminal empire. A soft knock at her door made her jump. "Emma?" "It's Samuel." She hesitated, then opened the door to find him standing on her porch, hat in hand and concern etched deep in his features. "I heard there was a stranger in town asking questions," he said without preamble. "About you." Emma's carefully constructed composure cracked. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that made Jim Patterson uncomfortable enough to come find me." The man claimed to be a distant relative looking for his lost cousin, Emma Hartwell. Samuel stepped closer, his voice dropping. "But Jim said something about him didn't sit right. Said he had the look of a man familiar with violence." The weight of her deception pressed down on Emma's shoulders. Samuel deserved the truth, especially if her presence was about to bring danger to his family and this peaceful town. "Samuel, there are things about me you don't know, things that might change your mind about your proposal." He studied her face in the lamplight. "Are you in some kind of trouble, Emma?" She almost laughed at the understatement. "Yes, more than you can imagine." Instead of backing away, Samuel stepped inside her cabin and closed the door behind him. "Then tell me." For a moment, Emma wavered on the precipice of honesty. She could confess everything: her real name, Vincent Kane, the murder she'd witnessed, the reason she'd been running for 2 years. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she thought of Sarah's innocent face and Thomas's shy smile. She thought of Samuel's ranch and the life he was trying to build for his children. "I can't," she whispered, "but I think you should withdraw your proposal. For your family's sake." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Let me be the judge of what's best for my family. You don't understand." "Then help me understand." He reached for her hands, his calloused fingers warm against her cold skin. "Whatever this is, we can face it together." The simple sincerity in his voice nearly broke her resolve. For just a moment, Emma allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to stop running, to trust someone completely. But outside, she could hear a horse's hoofbeats on the hard-packed earth, and she knew Marcus Webb was still watching, still waiting. The morning sun cast long shadows across the kitchen as Clara kneaded bread dough with more force than necessary. Each push and fold helped quiet the restless energy that had plagued her since their conversation 3 days ago. James had given her space to think, as promised, but his patient presence felt like a weight she couldn't shake. The sound of horses approaching made her freeze mid-motion. Through the window she watched 3 riders crest the hill, strangers, their faces hard beneath wide-brimmed hats. Her blood turned to ice as recognition dawned. The lead rider's distinctive scar running from his left ear to his jaw was unmistakable. Tommy Kane had found her. Clara's hands trembled as she wiped flour from her fingers. She'd known this day might come, but the reality of it struck her like a physical blow. 5 years of careful hiding, of building a new life, crumbled in an instant. "Miss Clara!" Lucy's voice carried from the parlor where she was practicing her letters. "There's men coming up the path." "Stay inside," Clara called back, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Keep Benjamin with you." She stepped onto the porch just as James emerged from the barn, his stride purposeful as he intercepted the riders. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested near his holster. "Gentlemen," James said, his voice carrying across the yard, "what can I do for you?" Tommy dismounted with practiced ease, his pale eyes scanning the ranch before settling on Clara. A cold smile played at his lips. "We're looking for someone, a woman who might go by Clara." "Don't know anyone by that name," James replied smoothly, though Clara caught the slight shift in his stance. He'd positioned himself between the men and the house. "Funny thing," Tommy continued, never taking his eyes off Clara, "she looks an awful lot like that pretty little thing standing on your porch there." The other two men spread out slightly, a movement that wasn't lost on James. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped forward. Running would only make things worse for all of them. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. Tommy's laugh was harsh. "Oh, I don't think so, darling. You see, you took something that belonged to my boss before you disappeared, money that wasn't yours to take." "The lady says you're mistaken," James said, his tone low and dangerous. "Might be time for you to move along." "Now, friend, this doesn't concern you." Tommy's hand drifted toward his gun. "We just need a few words with the lady, private-like." Clara saw James's jaw tighten and knew he wouldn't back down. The thought of him getting hurt because of her past made her stomach lurch. She descended the porch steps, ignoring the way James tensed at her approach. "Whatever you think I did," she said to Tommy, "I can explain." "Clara, no." James's voice cut through her words. He moved to her side, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You don't owe these men anything." For a moment, she was stunned by the quiet conviction in his voice. He didn't know what she'd done, didn't understand the danger she'd brought to his doorstep, yet he stood with her without hesitation. "The money your boss is missing," Clara said, meeting Tommy's gaze directly, "wasn't his to begin with. He stole it from families who could barely afford to lose it. That's not how Mr. Dalton sees it." Tommy's hand moved closer to his weapon. "He wants his property back, with interest." "How much?" James asked suddenly. Tommy's eyebrows rose. "Well now, that's mighty generous of you, friend. 2,000 ought to cover it." Clara gasped. It was a fortune, more than most people saw in a lifetime. "James, no, you can't." "I said how much," James repeated, his voice like granite. "Not whether I'd pay it." The tension stretched taut between the men. Clara could feel the violence hovering just beneath the surface, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite it. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of the front door and knew the children were listening. "Tell your boss," James said finally, "that if he wants to discuss debts, he can come himself, like a man. Until then, you're trespassing on my land." Tommy's scarred face darkened. "You're making a mistake, friend. Dalton doesn't like to be kept waiting. Then he shouldn't have sent boys to do a man's job." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Tommy's companions shifted restlessly, hands hovering near their guns. Clara held her breath, certain that any moment blood would spill on the dusty ground of the ranch she'd come to love. Instead, Tommy remounted his horse with deliberate slowness. "We'll be back," he said, his cold eyes moving between them. "And next time, we won't be so polite." The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Emma watched Jacob mend the fence near the pasture. His movements were deliberate, practiced, each swing of the hammer revealing the quiet strength she'd come to admire. 3 weeks had passed since their wedding, and she'd begun to find a rhythm in this new life, though the careful distance they maintained felt like walking on creek ice in early spring. Sarah burst through the kitchen door, her arithmetic slate clutched against her chest. "Miss Emma, Ma, Tommy won't listen to his multiplication tables again." The word Ma still caught Emma off guard, sending an unexpected warmth through her chest. "Where is he now?" "By the creek, throwing rocks and saying numbers are stupid." Emma sighed, untying her apron. She'd learned that Tommy's frustration often masked deeper feelings he couldn't yet articulate. The boy had been testing boundaries since the wedding, pushing against her authority while simultaneously seeking her attention. She found him exactly where Sarah had indicated, hurling stones into the water with more force than necessary. His shoulders were rigid with the particular anger that 8-year-old boys carried when the world felt too big and confusing. "The creek's taking quite a beating," Emma said, settling beside him on a fallen log. Tommy's throat faltered, but he didn't look at her. "Don't need to know numbers anyway. Pa says ranching's about knowing the land. Your pa also keeps ledgers, counts cattle, and calculates feed costs." Emma picked up a smooth stone, turning it over in her palm. "But you're right about the land being important." This earned her a sidelong glance. "Really?" "Really. The land tells stories if you know how to read them." She gestured toward the creek bank where the earth was soft and dark. "See those tracks? What do they tell you?" Tommy's curiosity won over his sulk. He crouched down, studying the muddy impressions. "Deer. Probably came to drink early this morning when the water's still cool. How many?" He counted carefully, following the trail with his finger. 3. No, wait, 4. There's a small one here." "Excellent observation. Now, if each deer drinks about 8 gallons of water per day, and they visit this spot twice daily, how much water do they take from this section of creek?" Tommy's face scrunched in concentration, and Emma could see him working through the problem without realizing he was doing mathematics. When he arrived at the answer, his eyes lit with genuine pride. They spent another hour by the creek, turning the natural world into lessons, until Tommy was solving problems eagerly, his earlier resistance forgotten. Walking back toward the house, Emma felt the satisfaction that had always drawn her to teaching. That moment when understanding dawned in a child's eyes. Jacob was waiting by the kitchen steps, his hat in his hands and something unreadable in his expression. "Emma, could I speak with you?" She nodded, following him toward the barn where they'd have privacy. The familiar scent of hay and leather wrapped around them as they stood in the doorway, neither quite willing to step fully inside together. "I wanted to thank you," Jacob said quietly, "for what you did with Tommy just now. I watched from the ridge, saw how you handled his temper. He's a bright boy. He just needs to understand why learning matters. His mother used to say the same thing." Jacob's voice carried the weight of memory. She had plans for both children, wanted them to have opportunities beyond this ranch. Emma felt the familiar pang that came whenever Margaret was mentioned. Not jealousy exactly, but the strange ache of trying to fill a space shaped by someone else's love. What kind of opportunities? College, maybe. Sarah talks about being a doctor, and Margaret always encouraged those dreams. He paused, studying Emma's face. "I never thought I could give them that kind of future, but watching you teach them, maybe it's possible." The hope in his voice was almost harder to bear than his earlier distance. Emma found herself stepping closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. "Jacob, I know this isn't what either of us planned," he continued, his gaze steady on hers. "But I want you to know that you're not just helping my children, you're saving them." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Emma felt the careful walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crack. Standing here in the golden afternoon light, watching this good man struggle to give his children the world, she forgot about Sam Morrison and bounty hunters and the life she'd fled. For one dangerous moment, she let herself imagine that this could be real, that she could be the woman Jacob needed, the mother his children deserved. "Emma?" Jacob's voice was softer now, uncertain. She realized she'd been staring at him, her thoughts surely written across her face. The space between them had somehow narrowed to mere inches, and she could see the question forming in his eyes, the same question that had been building between them for days. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barnyard as Clara gathered eggs, her mind still reeling from Thomas's revelation the night before. The McKinnons knew. After 3 years of careful hiding, of building a new life, her past had finally caught up with her. She clutched the wicker basket tighter, remembering the wanted poster Thomas had shown her, her own face staring back, younger and harder, beneath the name Catherine Mills. "Miss Clara!" Lucy's voice rang out from the porch. "Papa says breakfast is ready." Clara forced a smile and waved. though her stomach churned. How could she sit at their table knowing what Thomas knew? How could she look at those children and pretend everything was normal when their father was married to a woman wanted for murder? Inside, the kitchen buzzed with morning activity. Samuel stirred cornmeal mush while little Emma played with her corn husk doll in the corner. Thomas stood at the stove, his back rigid with tension. When he turned to face her, his eyes held a weariness that hadn't been there before. "Children," he said quietly, "eat your breakfast quickly. You'll be late for school." Clara moved mechanically through the morning routine, braiding Lucy's hair, checking Samuel's schoolwork, bundling Emma in her shawl for the walk to town. But beneath the normalcy, a current of unspoken words flowed between her and Thomas. Every glance carried weight. Every casual touch felt loaded with significance. The walk to the schoolhouse stretched longer than usual. Clara's students chattered around her, but their voices seemed to come from far away. She kept scanning the horizon, expecting to see riders approaching. The McKinnons had given her until Sunday, 4 days to make her decision, leave town quietly or face the consequences. Throughout the school day, Clara found herself studying each of her pupils' faces. Would she remember them years from now? Would they understand why their teacher had simply vanished? When young Billy Patterson struggled with his sums, she sat beside him longer than necessary, memorizing the way his tongue poked out in concentration. When Mary Gibson shared her lunch, a precious apple from their family's tree, Clara had to excuse herself to compose her emotions. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Through the schoolhouse window, Clara spotted 2 men on horseback approaching from the direction of town. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the McKinnon brothers, their faces grim beneath their hat brims. But they didn't dismount. Instead, they simply sat their horses at the edge of the schoolyard, a silent reminder of the sword hanging over her head. Clara continued the lesson with forced calm, but her hands trembled as she wrote arithmetic problems on the slate board. The children, sensing something amiss, grew restless. Even Lucy kept glancing toward the window with worried eyes. When the school bell finally rang, Clara watched her students file out, each one passing within yards of the McKinnons. The brothers' presence felt like a violation of the sanctuary she'd tried to create. This was her world, these children, this simple schoolhouse, the life she'd built from nothing. They had no right to poison it with threats. After the last child departed, the McKinnons finally dismounted. They approached the schoolhouse door with deliberate slowness, their spurs jangling ominously against the afternoon silence. Clara stood behind her desk, spine straight, refusing to show fear. "Afternoon, Miss Hayes," Jake McKinnon drawled, removing his hat with mock courtesy. "Mighty fine day for teaching, ain't it? What do you want?" Clara's voice remained steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Just wanted to see how you were settling into married life," Earl added, his smile cold. "Must be nice, having a fresh start, new name, new family, almost like being a different person entirely." The threat in his words was unmistakable. They were reminding her how much she had to lose. Clara thought of Emma's sleepy smile that morning, of Samuel's proud display of his penmanship, of Lucy's careful attention as Clara taught her to knead bread. She thought of Thomas and the way he'd looked at her the night before, not with disgust or fear, but with something that might have been understanding. "I know what you're doing," she said quietly, "and I know what you want. But these children have done nothing wrong. This school ain't our concern," Jake interrupted. "What concerns us is justice, and making sure certain debts get paid." After they left, Clara remained in the empty schoolhouse until the shadows grew long. She walked between the desks, touching each worn surface, remembering the faces that belonged to each seat. 3 years ago, she'd stumbled into this town bleeding and desperate, carrying nothing but guilt and the clothes on her back. Now she had more to lose than she'd ever imagined possible. The question that haunted her wasn't whether she was guilty of the crime that had set her running. The question was whether love, for these children, for this community, for the man who'd offered her sanctuary, was worth the risk of staying to fight. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the morning calm like glass against stone. Clara's hand stilled on the bread dough, flour coating her fingers as she peered through the kitchen window. 3 riders crested the hill, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew exactly where they were headed. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. "Mama Clara, who's coming?" Lucy's voice drifted from the table where she sat practicing her letters, but Clara barely heard her. She was already untying her apron, her mind racing through possibilities: the barn, the root cellar, the old mine shaft 2 miles north. "Take your brother to your room," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Stay there until I come for you." Something in her tone must have warned the girl. Lucy gathered Tommy without question, hustling him toward the stairs. Clara watched them disappear before moving to the window again. The riders were close enough now that she could make out details: worn leather chaps, dust-covered hats, the glint of metal at their hips, but not the faces, not yet. She forced herself to breathe, to think. James was in the far pasture with the cattle. Even if she could signal him somehow, he'd never reach the house in time. The shotgun hung above the fireplace, loaded and ready, but 3 against 1 were poor odds, especially with the children upstairs. The riders reined in at the fence line, and Clara's heart nearly stopped. The man in the center sat tall in his saddle, his silver hair visible beneath his black hat. Marshal Wade Garrett. She'd recognize that ramrod posture anywhere, even after 3 years, the same man who'd stood in her father's parlor and promised to bring her back to face justice. The same man whose relentless pursuit had driven her from town to town across half the territory. He'd found her. Somehow, impossibly, he'd found her. Clara's legs threatened to buckle, but she gripped the window frame and held herself upright. The other 2 men she didn't recognize, but their bearing marked them as lawmen or bounty hunters. They dismounted with practiced efficiency, their eyes scanning the property with professional assessment. She had perhaps minutes before they reached the door. Moving on instinct, Clara grabbed the small leather satchel she kept hidden behind the flour barrel. Inside were her emergency funds, false papers, and the Colt revolver she'd hoped never to use again. Her hands shook as she checked the cylinder. 6 bullets. It would have to be enough. Boots on the porch steps, the heavy rap of knuckles against wood. "Open up. This is Marshal Garrett. We need to speak with you." That voice, deep and gravelly, aged by years of hard living and harder choices. It carried her back to that terrible night in Silver Creek, when everything she'd believed about justice and mercy had crumbled to ash. Clara closed her eyes for one precious moment, allowing herself to remember James's face this morning at breakfast. The way he'd smiled at her over his coffee cup, the warmth in his dark eyes that spoke of growing affection, the careful way he'd been courting her within the bounds of their arrangement, as if she were something precious rather than a woman bought with desperation. She thought of Lucy's laughter echoing through the house, of Tommy's small hand in hers as they fed the chickens, of the life she'd built here brick by careful brick, a life she'd known was borrowed but had dared to hope might become real. The knocking came again, more insistent. "Mrs. Matthews, we know you're in there. We just want to talk." Mrs. Matthews, the name she'd worn like armor, protecting the woman she'd become from the girl she'd been. But armor could be pierced, and Wade Garrett had always been thorough. Clara moved to the base of the stairs. "Lucy," she called softly. "Are you listening?" "Yes, ma'am." The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "When I tell you, take Tommy and go out the back window. Run to your father. Tell him—" She paused, swallowing hard. "Tell him Clara says thank you for everything. Can you remember that? I don't understand. Aren't you coming with us?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back the sob that threatened to escape. Through the window, she saw one of the men circling toward the back of the house. They were experienced enough to cover the exits. "Sometimes grown-ups have to handle things alone," she managed. "But I need you to be brave for me. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." The doorknob rattled. Clara straightened, smoothing her skirts with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't let fear rule her final moments in this house. This home. She walked to the door and turned the key. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching Daniel teach young Tommy how to properly hold a rope. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her coffee cup, the events of the previous night still raw in her memory. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with thoughts of Marcus Webb's cold eyes and the promise of violence they held. "Mama Clara, look!" Sarah's voice broke through her dark reverie. The little girl burst through the kitchen door, cheeks flushed with excitement, clutching a handful of wildflowers. "I picked these for you!" Clara's heart constricted at the simple gesture, at the trust and affection in Sarah's bright eyes. She knelt down to receive the flowers, breathing in their sweet fragrance. "They're beautiful, sweetheart. Should we put them in water?" As they arranged the flowers in a mason jar, Clara caught sight of Daniel through the window again. He'd paused in his instruction, his gaze finding hers across the distance. Even from here, she could see the concern etched in his features, the way his shoulders carried the weight of their shared burden. The sound of approaching horses sent ice through her veins. Clara's hand instinctively moved to the small of her back, where she'd taken to carrying the derringer Daniel had insisted she keep. Through the window she watched 3 riders crest the hill, their silhouettes dark against the morning sky. "Sarah, go to your room and stay there until I come get you," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "But, Mama Clara—" "Now, sweetheart, please." Daniel had already spotted the riders. Clara watched him guide Tommy toward the house, his movements casual but purposeful. He caught her eye through the window and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Not Webb, not yet. The riders drew closer, and Clara recognized the lead figure, Sheriff Morrison, flanked by 2 deputies she didn't know. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by a new kind of dread. Lawmen asking questions could be just as dangerous as bounty hunters with guns. Daniel met them in the yard, his posture relaxed but alert. Clara moved closer to the window, straining to hear their conversation over the distance and the glass barrier. "Morning, Daniel?" Sheriff Morrison's voice carried on the still air. "Sorry to bother you, but I need to ask some questions." "About what?" "There was some trouble in town last night. Fight at the saloon. Man got himself shot." Clara's breath caught. The deputy Daniel had confronted. Had their encounter escalated after she and Daniel left? "Anyone I know?" Daniel asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Stranger. Called himself Webb. Said he was looking for someone. Described a woman with dark hair and green eyes." Morrison's gaze shifted toward the house. "Said she might be going by a different name now." The world seemed to tilt around Clara. Webb was dead. The relief was so sudden and overwhelming that she had to grip the windowsill to keep from falling. "Sounds like a bounty hunter," Daniel said. "We get them through here sometimes, chasing ghosts and old stories." "That's what I figured, but I had to check." "You haven't seen anyone matching that description, have you? Someone new to the area?" Clara held her breath. This was it. The moment when Daniel could end everything, could free himself and his children from the danger she'd brought to their doorstep. She would understand. She would even be grateful. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Clara could see him considering his words carefully. When he spoke, his voice was firm and clear. "Sheriff, the only woman fitting that description around here is my wife, and she's been Clara Thornton for going on 2 months now." The casual way he claimed her, the absolute certainty in his voice, brought tears to Clara's eyes. He wasn't just protecting. He was choosing her, publicly and irrevocably. "Your wife?" Morrison sounded surprised. "Well, I'll be damned, Daniel. Congratulations. When did you go and get married?" "Been meaning to tell folks properly, but you know how it is with the ranch and the children. Clara's been teaching them, helping us get by." "Well, that's wonderful news. Mary'll want to meet her properly, bring a proper wedding gift." Morrison gathered his reins. "Sorry to bother you with this foolishness. That Webb fellow was drunk and looking for trouble. Found it too." As the sheriff and his deputies rode away, Clara sank into a kitchen chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Webb was dead. The immediate threat was gone. But more than that, Daniel had claimed her as his wife in front of the law, in front of the community. There would be no easy way back from that declaration. She heard his boots on the porch steps, the gentle creak of the door opening. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his eyes found hers immediately. "It's over," he said simply. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. But even as relief washed over her, she knew that in many ways their real story was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Clara packed her few belongings into the worn leather satchel. Her hands trembled as she folded the blue dress Thomas had admired, the one she'd worn to their first church service together as husband and wife. The memory of his proud smile that day felt like a knife twisting in her chest. She had to leave before he returned from town, before the children woke, before her resolve crumbled entirely. The letter from Marshal Hayes lay open on the kitchen table, its words burned into her memory. Eleanor Blackwood seen in Copper Creek territory, reward doubled, armed and extremely dangerous. Below that, a description that matched her perfectly, down to the small scar above her left eyebrow. A souvenir from her father's last drunken rage. Footsteps creaked on the porch, and Clara's heart stopped. Thomas stepped through the door, flour and supplies in his arms, his eyes immediately finding the packed bag in her hands. "Going somewhere?" His voice was carefully controlled, but she caught the tremor beneath. Clara lifted her chin, forcing steel into her spine. "I should have left weeks ago." Thomas set down the supplies with deliberate care. "Because of that." He nodded toward the marshal's letter. "You read it?" "Hard to miss when it's addressed to the ranch." His blue eyes searched her face. "Eleanor Blackwood. That's not really your name either, is it?" The question hung between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Clara's carefully constructed world, Clara Hartwell, the respectable widow, the schoolteacher, the woman worthy of a good man's love, crumbled with each passing second. "No," she whispered. "My real name is Elena Santos. Eleanor Blackwood is what they called me after—" She couldn't finish. "After what, Elena?" Thomas stepped closer, and she noticed he used her real name without hesitation, as if he'd been waiting to know her truly. "After I killed a man." The words fell like stones into still water. Thomas didn't flinch, didn't step back. "Tell me." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her. "I was 17. My father sold me to pay his gambling debts. The man who bought me—" She wrapped her arms around herself. "He thought I was property to be used. When he came to my room that night, I had my father's old pistol. I didn't mean to kill him, just scare him, but you defended yourself." Thomas's voice was firm. "The law didn't see it that way. A Mexican girl killing a wealthy white man? I ran before they could hang me." She met his eyes, expecting disgust, condemnation. Instead, she found something that looked like admiration. "How long have you been running?" 8 years. I've been Clara Hartwell for the last 3, since I came to Copper Creek. Before that, I was Sarah Mitchell, then Mary O'Brien. I thought I could finally stop here, build something real, but you fell in love." The simple truth of it stopped her cold. "Yes." Thomas reached for her hands, stilling their trembling. "Elena Santos. I like knowing your real name." "Thomas, you don't understand. The marshal is offering $1,000 for my capture. If they find me here, you'll lose everything. The ranch, custody of the children. I won't let that happen." "Where will you go?" "Mexico, maybe, or California. Somewhere they won't think to look. What if you didn't have to run anymore?" Clara stared at him. "That's not possible." "What if it were?" His hands tightened on hers. What if there was another way? Before she could answer, the kitchen door burst open. Sarah and Jamie tumbled in, followed by Michael, who stopped short at the sight of Clara's bag. "Mama Clara, are you leaving us?" Sarah's voice was small, frightened. The word "mama" hit Elena like a physical blow. These children had become hers in every way that mattered. The thought of never seeing Sarah's gap-toothed grin, or Jamie's serious concentration over his schoolwork, or Michael's slow-growing trust nearly brought her to her knees. I have to, sweetheart. Because of the bad men Papa told us about? Michael stepped forward, his young face set with determination. We won't let them take you. Thomas had told them. Of course he had. He was honest with his children about everything. It's not that simple, Michael. Yes, it is, Jamie piped up. This is your home now. You belong with us. Elena looked around the kitchen, at the children's faces full of fierce loyalty, at Thomas standing solid and unwavering beside her, at the life she'd built from nothing but hope and determination. For the first time in 8 years, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was tired of running. What did you mean, she asked Thomas quietly, about another way? His smile was slow and sure. Trust me? The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Samuel mend the fence near the barn. His movements were deliberate, practiced, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. 3 days had passed since she'd confessed her past, and though he'd held her that night, whispered reassurances in her hair, something had shifted between them. She turned back to the stove where bacon sizzled in the cast-iron pan. The children would be awake soon, expecting breakfast and normalcy, unaware that their world might crumble at any moment. Margaret had barely slept, her mind churning with possibilities, escape routes, the weight of loving people she might have to leave behind. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. Through the window, she saw 2 riders approaching the house, their badges glinting in the morning light. Her blood turned to ice. "Samuel," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow he heard her. Their eyes met across the yard, and she saw him straighten, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle leaning against the fence post. Margaret untied her apron with trembling fingers and smoothed her dress. She had always known this moment might come. She'd rehearsed it in her mind 100 times during sleepless nights in Kansas City, but she'd never imagined children would be involved, or a man whose love had become more precious than her own freedom. The deputies dismounted as Samuel approached, his stride measured and calm. Margaret stepped onto the porch, her chin lifted despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Morning, gentlemen," Samuel said, his voice neutral. "Something I can help you with?" The older deputy, a man with graying whiskers and hard eyes, touched the brim of his hat. "Morning. We're looking for a woman named Mary Catherine Morrison. We have reason to believe she might be in these parts." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Mary Catherine Morrison. The name felt foreign now, like a dress that no longer fit. She was Margaret Hayes now, had been for months. But the law didn't care about the woman she'd become. "Don't know anyone by that name," Samuel said, and Margaret was grateful he could say it truthfully. What she wanted for? Theft. Grand larceny. Stole a considerable sum from her employer back in Kansas City. The deputy's gaze swept over Margaret, lingering with casual interest. Red-haired woman, about 5 feet 4 inches. Disappeared about a year ago. Margaret touched her hair self-consciously. She'd darkened it with walnut dye when she'd first arrived, but the red still showed through in certain light. The deputy's eyes narrowed slightly. "This your wife?" he asked Samuel. "Yes." The word came out firm, protective. "Margaret Hayes. We married last spring. Where you from originally, Mrs. Hayes?" The deputy's tone was conversational, but Margaret heard the trap in it. Illinois, she lied smoothly. The fabrication she'd practiced countless times. Small farming community outside of Springfield. The younger deputy had been scanning the property, but now his attention focused on her completely. "Funny thing about red hair," he said slowly. "Hard to hide, even when you try to cover it up." Samuel stepped closer to the porch, his body angled protectively between Margaret and the lawman. "My wife's never been to Kansas City. Wouldn't even know how to get there from here." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Margaret could hear movement inside the house. Thomas and Emma would be awake soon, would come looking for breakfast, and find their world turned upside down. The thought of them witnessing her arrest, of trying to explain why she was being taken away, nearly broke her resolve. "Mind if we search the house?" the older deputy asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Actually, I do mind," Samuel replied evenly. "Unless you have a warrant, you're not welcome in my home." The deputies exchanged glances. Margaret could see them weighing their options. They suspected, but they couldn't be certain. Her changed appearance, Samuel's steadfast support, the months that had passed since Mary Morrison's disappearance, it all created reasonable doubt. "We'll be staying in town for a few days," the older deputy said finally, remounting his horse. "Asking around. If anyone remembers seeing this Morrison woman, we'd appreciate hearing about it." As they rode away, Margaret's legs nearly gave out. Samuel was beside her in an instant, his arm around her waist. "They'll be back," she whispered. "Maybe. Maybe not. Samuel, if they arrest me, they won't." His voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "We won't let them." Inside the house, Thomas called out for breakfast, his voice sleepy and trusting. Margaret closed her eyes, drawing strength from the sound. She had found something here worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. But as she looked toward town, where the deputies had disappeared, she wondered if love alone would be enough to save them all. The sound of hoofbeats thundering across the dusty ground sent ice through Clara's veins. She pressed her back against the kitchen wall, peering through the lace curtains as 3 riders approached the ranch house. Even from a distance, she recognized the way Marcus Dalton sat his horse, rigid, predatory, like a man who'd never learned to bend. "Papa?" Lucy's voice drifted from the front room, where she and Thomas were working on their lessons. "Who's coming?" "Stay inside," Clara called, her voice steadier than her racing heart. She reached for the rifle James kept by the door, her fingers trembling as she checked the chamber. 3 years of peace. 3 years of believing she'd finally escaped her past. And now it had found her anyway. The riders stopped just outside the fence, close enough that she could see the glint of sunlight off their belt buckles and the cruel twist of Marcus's mouth. He hadn't changed much. Still lean and dangerous, still carrying himself like he owned everything his eyes fell upon, including her, Clara Whitmore, his voice carried across the yard like a whip crack. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." She closed her eyes, drawing in a shaky breath. Whitmore, her maiden name, the name she'd carried when she testified against him, when she'd put him behind bars for killing her brother, the name she'd buried when she became Clara Hartwell, schoolteacher and eventually Clara Morrison, wife and stepmother. "Mama Clara?" Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, his young face creased with worry. "Should I get Papa from the south pasture?" No. The word came out sharper than she intended. James would come running if the children went for him, would put himself between her and danger without hesitation. She couldn't let that happen. "Take Lucy upstairs. Both of you stay there until I say otherwise." Thomas started to protest, but something in her expression stopped him. He nodded and disappeared, and she heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard him quietly explaining to Lucy that they needed to go to their rooms. Clara stepped onto the porch, rifle held loose in her hands but ready. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the chill in her bones. "Marcus." She kept her voice level, neutral. "I heard you were still in prison." His laugh was ugly. "Good behavior, Clara. Amazing how cooperative a man can be when he's got proper motivation." His pale eyes swept over the ranch house, the neat garden, the children's toys scattered in the yard. "Pretty little life you've built here. Be a shame if something happened to it." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Clara's grip tightened on the rifle. "What do you want?" "Justice." He spurred his horse closer, and she could see the scar along his jaw where a fellow prisoner had tried to cut his throat. "You lied on that witness stand. Told them I killed your worthless brother, when you know damn well it was self-defense." Samuel was unarmed. The words tasted bitter. "You shot him in the back while he was walking away." "Your word against mine." "And now I'm thinking maybe folks around here would be interested to know that their sweet little schoolteacher ain't quite who she pretends to be." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Everything she'd built here, everything she'd fought for, James, The children, the life they'd created together. It could all crumble with a few well-placed words. Small towns had long memories for scandal. "I'll give you one chance," Marcus continued, his voice dropping low. "You write a letter to the sheriff back in Denver. Tell them you made a mistake. Tell them you were confused, grieving, that you didn't see what really happened that night. Get my name cleared, and I'll ride out of here peaceful-like. And if I don't—" His smile was all teeth. "Well, accidents happen on ranches. Fires start. People get hurt. Children especially. They're so fragile, so trusting." The blood roared in Clara's ears. She raised the rifle slowly, steadily, until it pointed directly at Marcus's chest. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of a floorboard and knew without looking that Lucy and Thomas were probably watching from the upstairs window despite her orders. "You listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "If you so much as look at those children wrong, if you come within a mile of them or my husband, I will put a bullet through your black heart and sleep sound that night." Marcus's companions shifted nervously in their saddles, hands moving toward their guns, but Marcus himself seemed amused by her threat. 3 years of playing house have made you soft, Clara. You always were too tender-hearted for your own good." He touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. "I'll give you until tomorrow to think it over. Choose wisely." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. Clara stood frozen on the porch long after the dust had settled, the rifle still clutched in her white-knuckled hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Elena stood at the kitchen window, watching Thomas harness the horses. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her coffee cup, the weight of last night's decision settling over her like a heavy cloak. She had chosen love over safety, chosen to stay and fight rather than run. But in the harsh light of dawn, the magnitude of what that meant crystallized with terrifying clarity. Thomas had left before sunrise to ride the perimeter, checking for any sign of Morrison's men. The kiss they had shared seemed like a lifetime ago, though her lips still burned with the memory of it. She touched her fingers to her mouth, wondering if she would live to feel his kiss again. "Mama Elena, you look sad." Little Sarah's voice broke through her reverie. The child stood in the doorway, her nightgown wrinkled from sleep, clutching her worn rag doll. Elena forced a smile and knelt to Sarah's level. "Just thinking, sweetheart. Are you hungry for breakfast?" Before Sarah could answer, the thunder of hoofbeats echoed across the yard. Elena's blood turned to ice as she recognized the sound. Too many horses, riding too fast. Through the window, she saw Thomas racing toward the house, his face grim with urgency. "Sarah, go wake your brother. Quickly now." Elena's voice remained steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsed it in her mind countless times during sleepless nights on the run. Thomas burst through the door, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "They're coming. Maybe a dozen riders, armed and moving fast." Elena nodded, her mind shifting into the cold, calculating state that had kept her alive for 3 years. "How long do we have?" 20 minutes, maybe less. Thomas moved to the gun cabinet, pulling out his rifle and a box of ammunition. "Elena, there's still time for you to take the children and—" "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "We discussed this. I'm not running anymore." Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, Elena saw her own determination reflected in his gaze. Whatever happened, they would face it together. "The children need to be safe," she said, her voice softening. "The root cellar?" Thomas nodded. "It's well hidden, and there's another way out through the old mine shaft if needed." Elena hurried to gather Sarah and young Michael, who emerged from their room rubbing sleep from his eyes. At 12, Michael was old enough to understand danger when he saw it, and his face paled as Thomas briefly explained the situation. "I can fight," Michael said, trying to make his voice sound deeper than his years. "I know how to shoot." Thomas placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your job is to protect your sister. That's the most important thing you can do." Elena led the children to the hidden cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards, a space Thomas had expanded and provisioned weeks ago when the threats first began. She kissed each child's forehead, tasting salt from tears she didn't remember shedding. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear," she whispered. "Michael, you remember the way to the mine shaft?" The boy nodded solemnly, his arm protective around his sister. Elena replaced the floorboards and scattered the rug back into place, just as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Through the window, she could see dust clouds rising in the distance, and her heart hammered against her ribs. Thomas checked his rifle one final time, then moved to stand beside her. "Elena, I need you to know—" "Don't." She pressed her fingers to his lips. "Don't say goodbye. We're going to survive this." He caught her hand, pressing it flat against his chest, where she could feel his heart beating strong and steady. "Whatever happens, you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. You brought hope back into this house." The riders were close enough now that Elena could hear individual voices shouting orders. Morrison's voice rose above the rest, commanding his men to surround the house. She recognized the cold authority in his tone, the same voice that had once whispered promises of love in her ear before showing her the monster beneath. "James Morrison," Thomas called out as the riders formed a circle around the house. "You're trespassing on my land." Morrison's laugh carried across the yard, devoid of warmth or humor. "I'm here for what belongs to me, Garrett. Send out my wife, and maybe I'll let you keep breathing." Elena stepped into the doorway beside Thomas, her chin raised defiantly despite the fear coursing through her veins. Morrison sat astride his black horse, looking exactly as she remembered, handsome, well-dressed, and radiating the quiet menace of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. "I'm not your wife," Elena called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I never was." Morrison's smile was cold as winter. "That's where you're wrong, my dear Catherine, and it's time you came home." The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching Samuel teach little Emma how to properly hold the reins of her pony. 3 months had passed since their wedding, and the sight of her husband's patient hands guiding their daughter's small fingers still made her heart flutter with an emotion she'd never expected to feel again. "Mama Clara, look!" Emma's voice rang out across the yard as she managed to guide the pony in a small circle without Samuel's help. Clara smiled and waved, but the word "Mama" still caught in her throat. The children had begun calling her that naturally without prompting, and each time it felt like both a gift and a weight she wasn't sure she deserved. Thomas emerged from the barn carrying a bucket of grain, his 14-year-old frame filling out with the hard work of ranch life. He'd grown taller in recent months, and Clara could see more of Samuel in him with each passing day, the same determined set to his jaw, the same careful way of moving that spoke of a man who thought before he acted. "Morning, Clara," he called out, and she marveled at how easily he'd accepted her presence in their lives. There had been no dramatic declarations of love or resistance, just a gradual warming that felt as natural as sunrise. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the road, and her blood turned to ice when she recognized the rider in the lead. Marshal Hendricks sat tall in his saddle, his badge glinting in the morning light, and behind him rode 2 other men she didn't recognize, but whose hard faces suggested they weren't here for a social call. Clara's hand instinctively moved to the small of her back where she used to keep a derringer, but that weapon, like her old life, had been buried months ago. She forced herself to remain calm as she walked out to the porch, smoothing her apron with trembling fingers. Samuel had seen the riders too, and was already walking toward the house, his face carefully neutral but his eyes alert. He reached Clara's side just as the marshal dismounted. "Marshal Hendricks," Samuel said with a polite nod. "What brings you out our way?" The marshal touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, Samuel, Mrs. Morrison." His eyes lingered on Clara with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I'm afraid this isn't a social call. We've had some new information come to light about wanted criminals who might be in the area." Clara felt Samuel's hand brush against hers. a subtle gesture of support that gave her strength. "Is that so?" she managed to say, proud that her voice remained steady. "Yes, ma'am. We're looking for a woman who goes by several names. Catherine Wade, Kitty Walsh, Catherine Williams." Each alias hit Clara like a physical blow, but she kept her expression carefully blank. "She's wanted in connection with a bank robbery in Colorado Territory. 3 men died in that robbery, Mrs. Morrison." "That's terrible," Clara said, and meant it. The deaths had haunted her for 2 years, even though she'd only been the lookout, even though she'd been coerced into helping by a man who'd threatened worse than prison if she refused. Samuel stepped slightly forward, his presence protective without being obvious about it. "What does this have to do with us, Marshal?" "Well, the thing is, Samuel, we received word that this woman might have come through Willow Creek some months back, might have even settled here under a new name." The Marshal's eyes never left Clara's face. Witnesses described a woman matching her description. Dark hair, green eyes, educated manner. Sound familiar? The air between them felt charged with danger, and Clara could hear her pulse pounding in her ears. In the distance, Emma's laughter carried on the wind as she continued her riding lesson, oblivious to the drama unfolding near the house. "Marshal," Samuel said quietly, "my wife and I were married 3 months ago. She came here to be the school teacher with proper references and credentials. I'm sure you can understand that these accusations are quite serious." "Oh, I understand completely, Samuel. And I'm sure Mrs. Morrison wouldn't mind answering a few questions to clear this all up." The Marshal's smile was cold as winter steel. After all, an innocent woman has nothing to hide. Clara met his gaze steadily, drawing on every ounce of courage she'd built up over the past months of happiness. She thought of Emma's trusting smile, of Thomas's grudging acceptance, of Samuel's gentle hands and patient heart. She thought of the life they'd built together, fragile and precious as spun glass. "Of course, Marshal," she said quietly. "Ask your questions." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her, and she wondered if love would be enough to survive what was coming. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge as Elena walked toward the courthouse, her heart hammering against her ribs. Each step felt weighted with the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Behind her, Thomas matched her pace, his presence both comforting and terrifying in equal measure. Word had spread through town like wildfire overnight. Marshal Davies had arrived with 3 federal agents at dawn, their official papers rustling in the desert breeze as they questioned anyone who might know the whereabouts of one Catherine Morrison, a woman wanted for theft and conspiracy in connection with the Dalton gang's bank robberies 2 years prior. Elena's carefully constructed new life was crumbling with each passing hour, but something had shifted inside her during the sleepless night. The woman who had run from town to town, always looking over her shoulder, was tired of running. More than that, she had found something worth fighting for. "You don't have to do this," Thomas murmured as they reached the courthouse steps. His weathered hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a desperate tenderness. "We could still leave, take the children and head west, start fresh somewhere they'll never find us." Elena turned to face him, studying the man who had become her anchor in ways she never expected. His blue eyes held no judgment, only love and fierce protectiveness. The realization that he was willing to abandon everything, his ranch, his life's work, to save her nearly brought her to her knees. "No more running," she whispered, touching his cheek. "These children need stability. They need their home, their father, and I need to face what I've done." The courthouse door opened, and Marshal Davies emerged, his badge catching the morning light. His eyes found Elena immediately, recognition flickering across his weathered features. Behind him, the 3 federal agents fanned out, hands resting casually but meaningfully near their weapons. "Catherine Morrison," Davies called out, his voice carrying across the small crowd that had gathered. "Or do you prefer Elena Vasquez these days?" Elena straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from Thomas's presence beside her. "My name is Elena Crawford," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Elena Crawford. Davies raised an eyebrow at her response, noting the simple gold band on her finger. "Mrs. Crawford, then, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit robbery and theft in connection with crimes committed by the Dalton gang." As the marshal approached with iron shackles, Elena felt Thomas tense beside her. She squeezed his hand once, firmly, meeting his gaze with all the love she couldn't put into words. "Take care of Mary and Samuel," she whispered. "Tell them I love them. Tell them this isn't goodbye." But as Davies reached for her wrists, a voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Wait." Everyone turned to see Judge Harrison emerging from the courthouse, his black robes billowing behind him. In his hands, he carried a leather portfolio thick with documents. "Marshal, I believe there are some irregularities in your warrant that need addressing before any arrests are made," the judge announced, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. Davies frowned, clearly irritated. "Judge, this is federal business. The warrant is in order." "Perhaps," Harrison replied coolly. "But this woman is a resident of my jurisdiction, married to one of our most respected citizens. I've received some interesting correspondence overnight that suggests your case may not be as airtight as you believe." Elena's breath caught as the judge opened his portfolio, revealing what appeared to be official documents and correspondence. Thomas's hand tightened around hers, hope flickering in his expression. "It seems," Judge Harrison continued, "that one James Dalton, currently serving time in federal prison, has provided a detailed confession absolving Mrs. Crawford of any willing participation in the gang's activities. According to his sworn statement, she was coerced under threat of death and had no knowledge of their criminal intentions when she aided in their escape." The federal agents exchanged uncertain glances. Davies stepped forward, his jaw tight with frustration. "Judge, with respect, that evidence would need to be verified through proper channels." "Indeed it would," Harrison agreed. "Which is why I'm ordering Mrs. Crawford to remain in Cedar Ridge under the supervision of this court while the matter is investigated properly. She's been a model citizen here, Marshal. She's married, contributes to our community, teaches our children. Flight risk seems minimal under the circumstances." Elena felt the world tilt around her as the impossible became reality. Someone had fought for her, had found a way to give her the one thing she'd never dared hope for, a chance to stay and fight instead of run. As the marshal grudgingly agreed to the judge's terms, Elena finally understood what Thomas had been trying to tell her all along. Home wasn't a place you found. It was a place you fought to keep. And for the first time in years, she was ready to fight.